Do you want to learn game dev in the fastest way possible? Today, we are going to cover the absolute best projects to learn game development as a beginner, as well as the specific steps to complete these projects and the skills that you will learn with them in order to be able to create your dream game. Now, keep in mind, this is not a coding tutorial. Instead, it's a guide to create those games on your own, which is the only way to actually learn. The first two projects are going to be purely code based and focus on complete beginners. So if you already know how to code, you can skip this. If you don't know which programming language you should use, any option is fine, but I recommend sticking to whichever language your game engine uses. So if you haven't picked a game engine yet, you can check this video. You may also be wondering if learning programming is really necessary. In my opinion, yes, you should learn how to code. Now, that doesn't mean that you should memorize all the syntax and uses for a specific language, but there are basics that will open so many new possibilities. So I recommend putting in that little extra work and learning how to code. And there isn't a better way to learn the basics than by making a random number guesser. This is the most basic thing you can create with code that is not a hello world. And if you're a complete beginner, it's a great first exercise. The steps to make this are simple. First, generate a number and store it in a variable. Then, ask for user input and store it in a different variable. Now compare both digits and check if they got it right. If not, loop the user input and compare until they get it right. And that's it. You can also make it a bit better with a hint system by checking not only if the number is the same, but also if it's higher or lower. Now, this exercise may be super simple, but it will teach you the basics of programming, such as loops, user input, random number generation, etc. The second project is a text-based adventure. This type of project is still purely code-based and doesn't require any game engine or graphics, but it will give you a taste of how games are structured logically. And if you really like whatever story you came up with, who knows? Maybe you can turn it into an actual project by adding some graphics later. The steps to complete this project would be: first, write the story and create a flowchart or decision tree for it. Basically, start with node 1, which would always be the same, and then whenever the player makes a significant choice, move them in a direction or another. Once the story is ready and you start coding, you'll need to implement player choices. This can be done by asking for an input such as write 1 if you want to open the door, or write 2 if you want to jump through the window. By doing this, you will also learn to control input. So for example, if the only options are 1 and 2, and the user writes 3, you can control this and tell the player that that's not an option. That way you will get used to players messing up, which is way too common. In order to keep the game simple, since you're still a beginner, you can track the user progress using variables. For example, you can create a string for the current location, an array for the inventory, and if you want to implement health, you can use just a number, and another for the damage, and maybe a dictionary for the story. With all these things, you can check, for example, if player location is village, and save villager story is true, and the inventory includes a ring, give the option to open a magic portal. If instead they have a sword in the inventory, give the options to go to the sewers. Once again, you can make this as simple or as complex as you want. You could remove player inventory, health, and location, and just create a choice object or dictionary for the different choices. The things you will learn with this project are many, and of course, the more complex your game is, the more things you will learn. Now, the main thing you'll learn is state management. You will learn how to handle arrays, objects, and dictionaries, and more simple variables like strings and integers. You will also get more comfortable with loops. For example, you can implement combats where every turn you will deal damage to the enemy equal to your damage, and they will deal damage to your character. If either your health or the enemies goes down to 0, you can finish the combat, update the inventory if the enemy drops something, etc. And of course, you will get used to conditional statements, since you will be constantly checking if the player is in X or Y location, their choices, etc. And with this, you already learn all the basics about programming. So it's time to move on to a game engine. Once again, I have a video where I cover most game engines and rank all of them, but as a quick summary, I will recommend you pick any of these. Personally, I like to use Godot. I think it's the best option right now, and it's only getting better and better thanks to it being open source. The first project using a game engine will be a bit easier on the programming side, as you will need to learn other aspects about the engine itself, such as physics, sprites, collisions, etc. So we'll start with something quite simple: Breakout or Brick Breaker, whatever you want to call it. First, you will want to create a paddle and add it to the main scene, as we are not gonna worry about menus or anything like that. For the paddle, you will want to create a movement script, where if you click the arrows or the A and D keys, it will move in the desired direction at the specified speed without leaving the limits of the screen. Next, we'll need a ball. At the start of the game, the ball will be just above the paddle and will be shot upwards with a slight angle. Whenever it touches a brick or the wall, it will bounce. Don't worry about it because all game engines have a pretty straightforward way of handling this. Now, in the case of the paddle, the behavior of the ball is a bit different, where rather than bouncing the ball, you will shoot it. So if the paddle touches the extreme right of the paddle, it will be shot in a really steep angle, and the closer it gets to the center, the more vertical it will bounce. To do this, you can get the position where the ball bounces and apply a force on the horizontal axis depending on where it is. As a hint, here is an example of how you can get the bounce position as a value between -1 and 1. Now that you have the ball and the paddle, it's time to create bricks that you can break. To do this, you just need a sprite to represent the brick and a collision to detect the ball. When the ball hits the brick, it will obviously break. There are a few different options to create these bricks, but I'm sure you got this. The last thing you need to detect is if the player misses the ball and it bounces out of the screen. In this case, you can just put the ball again at the initial position. With that, the base game will be ready, and you will have a super basic breakout game. If you want to take it to the next level, to learn even more, there are a few things that you can implement, such as bricks that you cannot break, or more interesting layouts. Also, bricks with different health stats, where you will need to hit them multiple times before they break. And of course, upgrades, such as spawning more balls, cloning all existing balls, slowing down time, or any other upgrade that you can come up with. With this game, you will learn all the basics about physics, player input and controls, collisions, etc. So it's an amazing project to get started with. The next project will be a 2D platformer. Don't worry, you don't need to create 9 worlds with multiple levels, dozens of enemies, and boss fights. I mean, you can if you want, but we are trying to keep it simple. First, you will need a character and a platform. Obviously, you will want the character to be affected by gravity, while the platform should be static. For the basic world, you can use a tileset with a collision, and later you can use static bodies for things like moving platforms. For the character, the things that you need to keep in mind are the horizontal movement, the vertical movement. If the player moves to the side, it will move just like the paddle. In the case of the jump, you will instead apply a negative force on the vertical axis, and this will send the character up. Depending on your goals, you can use different settings for the movement. For example, you can adjust the acceleration to make the movement more or less responsive, and also adjust the jump to change the strength depending on how long the jump button is pressed. Other things you should keep in mind are the coyote time and the input buffer. Coyote time is that extra grace period, usually just a few milliseconds, where the player is allowed to jump even after they left the edge of a platform. Input buffering consists of storing the user input so that if they press the jump button while still in the air, and then they hit the floor a few milliseconds later, the character will still jump. Without both of these things, the player may mistime the jump a bit, making it feel extremely punishing. It's time to add some complexity to your platformer. Let's start by introducing moving platforms. Moving platforms will require you to set up paths or points between which they will move. The key is to ensure that the character can stand on these platforms and move with them without slipping off. This will involve syncing the character's movement with the platform when they are in contact. You're also now given the choice of defining how the player will behave once they leave the platform. You can go with something like Celeste, where the platform speed is added to your body and you can use it to jump much further. Or you can do like Mario Bros, where if you jump, you will be left behind. Next, you will want to create enemies. There are many ways to approach enemy AI, but for simplicity, let's start with basic enemies that move back and forth. You can give them simple patrol paths, but this will require you to set those paths manually. Instead, I'd recommend you to use raycasts. To keep the explanation simple, when you use raycasts, you basically shoot a, ray in a given direction, and it will return whichever colliders it finds. You can add one in front of the enemy pointing to the floor, and if at some point it doesn't detect the floor, that means that the enemy will fall, and you can make it turn around. And of course, you can also make it turn around when it collides with a wall. Now, if the player collides with them, the player should either take damage or be knocked back. And you can also add a basic attack system where the player can jump on them or hit the enemies to defeat them. To make the world feel more alive, you can consider adding hazards. These should be placed strategically to challenge the player's platforming skills. If the player touches a hazard, they should either take damage or be sent back to the checkpoint. With the basics in place, you can now implement a checkpoint system. This will allow the player to respawn at the last checkpoint they activated if they die, rather than restarting the level entirely. Checkpoints can be simple objects in the level that the player must touch to activate. Finally, it's time to implement a goal. This could be as simple as reaching a flagpole or entering a door. When the player reaches this point, the level should be completed, and you can transition to the new level or display a victory screen. If you want to improve the game even more, you can add collectibles or power-ups. This is not a commercial game or anything, so don't worry about copying others. You can go with the ones we all know, such as increased size, shooting some kind of projectile, or whatever. Now, this is all assuming that you're creating a game like Mario Bros. But you could make a puzzle platformer or a precision platformer like Celeste, and your requirements will change depending on the type. This project will provide a deeper dive into physics, player input, etc. You will also learn how to use different types of nodes, as well as tile sets. You will also learn how to create checkpoints and how to handle the end of the game. And now onto the fifth project, a top-down shooter. Once again, we are gonna start by creating a player character. But in this case, it shouldn't be affected by gravity in any way, because it's a top-down game. This is even easier than creating a character with gravity, as you only need to move the character depending on the player input, without taking physics and colliders into consideration. You need to be careful though. If you write something like when pressing W move up by 1, and when pressing D move right by 1, if the player presses both keys simultaneously, the diagonal movement will be faster than intended, which is a really common mistake. And also now you can implement things like acceleration and friction, which you could modify if you want to simulate things like walking on ice or walking on slime, for example. The next thing you will need for a top-down shooter is shooting, obviously. There are many approaches to handle this, and depending on which engine you use, you may need to use things like object pooling for a complex project. But for now, let's keep it simple. You can just create an object like the ball you created for Breakout with a collider and a sprite, and a super simple script to move it in a straight line in whichever direction it's facing. Then, inside the player script, you will create a function to shoot the bullet in the direction of your mouse. Depending on your approach to the health system, the bullet may need a damage variable, and maybe even a health variable for penetrating bullets. When the bullet detects a collision, you should check the other body to see if it should destroy the bullet. For example, if it's a wall, you will destroy the bullet, but if it's glass, it may not affect it at all. And if you hit an enemy, then reduce the health of the bullet by 1, and if it reaches 0, destroy it. But you cannot check those other bodies if there's none, so let's create some enemies now. In this case, they are a bit more complex than the platformer enemies, and you can divide them into two different categories, range and melee. If they are the second type, when they detect the player, they will move towards him. I recommend not creating any obstacles for now, so that we can just make them move in a straight line. You will have time to explore complex pathfinding later. In the case of ranged enemies, you can challenge yourself a little bit and create a script where they will move towards the player until they are within shooting range, to then start shooting at him. You may even want to go a step further with a behavior where if the player gets too close to them, they will shoot a few times and then move away from the player towards a safer place, and then shoot again. To do this, you can create a minimum and maximum distance, where if the distance to the player is higher than the maximum, the enemy will move closer, and vice versa. To make this game even better, you can create a wave and enemy spawning system. You can trigger the spawning either through a timer or by checking if all the enemies have been defeated. To keep the game fair for the player, you will want the enemies to take a little bit before they start moving, and they should spawn at a certain distance from the player. I recommend making this entire game within a small arena and keeping the spawn area within the limits as well. You can ensure that they don't spawn outside by using raycasts, or you can be a bit more lazy and just check the global position of all 4 corners of the arena and making sure that the spawn point is inside those limits. I am super lazy, so the second option is how I usually handle these things. Some options to improve this game and take it to the next level are creating different weapons with different shooting patterns. and creating objects like grenades or potions to damage enemies and heal yourself, or damage yourself if you're dumb. The skills learned with this project are many, like more complex spawning, more complex enemy behaviors, handling different states for damage, health, etc. If you create pickups and different weapons, you will also learn how to handle inventory, and you can create a reload system too, to handle the total amount of bullets and the amount of bullets inside the gun at any given point. You can also use this reload system to make ranged enemies move to safety only while reloading, for example. And now let's go with the last project, tower defense game. For the first time, we will start the project a bit differently, since there's usually no player in a tower defense game. The most important aspect will be the map itself, which should be a grid. Generally speaking, this grid will have 5 different types of tiles. First, the path tile. Second, the block tile. Third, the tower placing spots. Fourth, a spawn point. And the last one, the end of the level. Now we will create the enemies. You will want them to spawn in a specific point in your grid, and then follow the path tiles until they reach their goal, which would be your base. This time you obviously don't want them to just walk in a straight line. Instead, you want them to have an actual grid-based pathfinding, otherwise the entire grid setup will be useless. You will also want to handle the enemy spawning using waves, and you will obviously need a health system for yourself and for each specific enemy. You can recycle these systems from the top-down shooter. When an enemy reaches your base, you will lose health, and when a wave finishes, the preparation phase will start, where you will be able to buy towers or upgrades. And then when you finish this phase, the next wave will start. But you don't need a preparation phase if you cannot buy anything or place towers, so that will be the next step. To keep it simple, you can create a tower that behaves like an enemy from the previous game, but without moving. Basically, you will place it in a tile, and it will shoot every few milliseconds to the enemies in range. The shooting itself is pretty easy. You just need an area for the range, and when the reload timer ends, it will shoot at an enemy. For now, we'll keep it simple and shoot the closest enemy. The most complex element will be the tower placement itself, making sure that it only happens in valid spots. And you should also create a resource like gold, which you will spend in order to place towers and buy their upgrades. When an enemy dies, they will give a certain amount of gold, depending on the type of enemy. You can achieve this by giving them a variable for the reward. And when they die, you can just trigger a signal and update the player's gold amount. And just like you need to trigger a signal to increase the gold when an enemy dies, you obviously need to reduce it when the tower is placed. With this, the base for the game is ready. You will want to start the game with a preparation phase and a low amount of gold, usually enough for 1 or 2 towers. Then when the player clicks on a button or a specific key, the first wave will start spawning. You can adjust the spawning ratio to increase or decrease the difficulty. For example, at first you can spawn enemies little by little, so that the towers can handle them, and then increase the spawn speed with every wave. After the last enemy is killed, the next preparation phase will start. If the player's health reaches 0, then they will lose, and you will reset all the values for health, waves, remove placed towers, etc. Now that this game is ready, let's make some improvements to learn even more. First, you can create different types of enemies. This should be pretty easy, as the only stats that you have are speed, health, and gold. You can create super fast and weak enemies, super strong and tanky ones, etc. Next, let's create different towers. You can create any that you want, but I will give you 2 really common options. A tower that slows enemies, and a tower that shoots explosive bullets. Let's start with the explosive one because it's the easiest. All you have to do is to create a new bullet. You can clone the previous one because the behavior is the same, and then you will create an explosion animation and increase the damage area by quite a lot, so that it can hit multiple enemies and not just one. Now when the bullet touches an enemy, it will trigger that animation, dealing damage to all surrounding enemies. As for the slowing turret, there are 2 approaches. One that shoots slowing bullets, and one that slows in an area. Let's go with the second option, to learn more about areas and timers. First, you will need to create an area around the turret. Then, when the area detects an enemy, it will trigger a slow function that you will create inside these enemies. But imagine that you have 100 enemy types. You don't want to create this inside every enemy. So here you will learn about composition. Take the movement scripts from the enemy itself and create a component called movement component, or whatever you want to call it. You can then place the movement logic in this component and add the movement component to every enemy to then modify their speed and all the stuff for each enemy. Now in the movement component you will create the slow function, which will reduce the speed by a set amount and start a timer. When the timer ends, the enemy will recover the original speed. And that's it, you learned composition and how to slow enemies. Composition is a super powerful tool that will help you finish your projects faster and in a more efficient way. And now we have multiple towers and enemies. And that's it. With this project, you will learn about resource management, grid-based movement and pathfinding, composition, etc. If you complete all these projects, you can consider yourself a proper game dev, and you will be able to complete any project in the future. I am sure of that. That doesn't mean that you won't need any help. We all do from time to time, but you will be able to find your own solutions, which is the most important thing. The next step will be to create a game that you actually like, and not just a learning project. So you should watch this video on how to come up with game ideas. See ya!